My name is Nando Parrado. I was one of the 16 survivors of Flight 571, which crashed in the Andes Mountains on Friday, the 13th of October, 1972. I knew a plane cannot fly that close to the mountains, and I looked towards my mother, and that was a moment of impact. I was in a very deep coma, so you wake up very slowly. And I woke up in hell. We waited for a rescue, but it didn't come. A plane that crashes in the middle of the mountains, in the snow season, there's no way people can survive. And after a week, after 10 days, after 3 weeks, after a month, after 2 months, who would believe there was people alive? The decision of eating the dead bodies of our friends started to creep into our minds at the same time, you know, because we all had the same fear, the same lack of hope, the same confirmation that we were dead. And I decided I was going to die, but I was going to die trying. Initially, the trip was planned for 4 days. We would leave on Thursday, and we would come back on Monday morning. You are young, you don't have that much money, and the easiest way and the cheapest one was to charter an Air Force plane. The night before the plane left for Santiago, the captain of the team told us that there were still 10 seats available on the airplane. And if anybody wanted to bring family or friends, they could go for free. So I jumped from my seat and I phoned my mother and said, "Mom, prepare a bag, you're going to Chile tomorrow. And tell Susie," Susie was my sister, "that she's going to." I wanted to give them a present of love, to invite them to go to Chile with us. They would shop and have a nice time. We would come back on Monday. But it never happened like that. We left on Thursday, but when the plane came close to the Andes, the weather was not very good, so it had to land in Mendoza, the last city in Argentina before the Andes, and we had to wait for the weather to be better so that the plane could cross. So we had to sleep in Mendoza that night. And the next morning, we went to the airport and we boarded the plane and we left finally on Friday morning for Santiago. Nothing made us think or believe that something terrible is going to happen. Friday the 13th. I'm not a superstitious person and I don't care about that, but I don't know. Friday the 13th and we crashed on that day. You know, some guys think about it, some don't. Obviously the pilot didn't think about it too much. How could a pilot make such a big mistake, a pilot with experience?
The captain on this flight was a Uruguayan Air Force colonel, and that implies that he was an experienced pilot. I know that he had 29 crossings of the Andes, which is a lot. However, his total time, his total flight experience was in the range of 5,200 hours. And by today's standards, 5,200 hours is not a lot of time.
The training by the crew was done according to international standards. It was in a good condition to fly, that plane, without any problems.
The Fairchild had a max gross takeoff weight of 45,000 pounds and carried anywhere between 45 and 50 passengers. The engines that it had were two Rolls-Royce Dart 7 engines, which are approximately 1,725 shaft horsepower each. The aircraft struggled because it was underpowered, and we pretty much referred to it as a lead sled.
Of the 78 Fairchild 227s built, 23 crashed, and there were a total of 393 fatalities. A third of them have been involved in accidents, which equates to not a very good safety record.
At the time, we didn't know that the safety record of that model was absolutely horrible. Had we known that, we would have never gotten into that airplane.
After takeoff from Mendoza, the captain elected to fly south and make a turn towards the Planchon Pass. The reason he elected to do this is because he could fly the aircraft through a pass and at a lower altitude. If he had elected to strictly go over the Andes, he would have had to go a lot higher, which would have been a lot more stressful on this aircraft. It has a hard enough time getting up to 15 or 16,000 feet, let alone what it would have needed to get over the Andes without going through a pass.
The Andes Mountains rise so abruptly that they create very serious storms. If the jet stream is coming from the Pacific, all this moist air gets funneled by the mountains. That speeds up winds and creates precipitation, creates clouds. And so the storms that can be formed by the Andes can be very fierce.
This was a team of friends, a team of young people flying to have a fantastic, fun weekend. So the mood in the airplane was absolutely happy. I remember people laughing, people talking, you know, sitting, kneeling down on the seats and looking back and talking with the guys.
We were all singing. We were all super happy, throwing the ball from one side to the other. It was quite a fun atmosphere.
Initially, I sat on the window. But Panchito Val was my best friend. He was like my brother. And he said, okay, you have been for a long time on the window. Let me look down. It's easier for me if I'm on the window to look out. So we changed seats. He sat on the window, I sat on the aisle. And that's one of those moments in life that, without thinking, we'll decide who would live and who would die, you know.
There was a cloud cover on the mountains, so they have to cross the Andes to Curicó, and they radio Santiago, we are on Curicó, and we want permission to turn north and then fly it north to Santiago.
Control Santiago, Fuerza Aérea, Uruguaya 571. Uruguaya 571, Santiago. Uruguaya 571 sobre Curicó.
The Fairchild was expected to arrive at Curicó at 3:33 p.m., but it reported that it was over Curicó at 3:24. That distance is usually covered in 11 minutes, and they reported that they covered it in 3 minutes. Surely the plane was still in the middle of the mountains.
So the pilots obviously made a mistake at some point, calculation. It's actually they're right in the middle of the range, and they're thinking they're already past it. He makes the unexplained and catastrophic decision of turning north into the Andes. This changes the fate of all the passengers on the plane.
So he decided to descend, and then as it was all covered by clouds, he didn't see that the mountains were under the clouds.
When a pilot gets into a position where he is not where he expects to be, or not where he thinks he is, in order to get out of that situation, he has to convince himself that he's made a mistake. And it's a different mindset. You have to now think that I've made a mistake, how am I going to get out of this?
The cause of the accident was clearly human error. Fault of the crew.
We started to get into some light, not very heavy turbulence, you know. The plane started to shake a little.
The flight attendant came out into the cabin and said, "Put your seatbelts on, because the plane is going to dance a little bit."
And then we got into a little bit heavier turbulence, and the mood changed a little bit. Nobody was throwing balls. You know, everybody was sitting on the seat with the seatbelt fastened.
They head down through the clouds and they think they're descending into Chile. And of course, as you get closer to the mountains, there's the turbulence of all the wind currents that the mountains create. So they start shaking. They come from off the cloud cover and realize that they're completely surrounded by rocks and mountains.
There was a feeling of fear, and the fear transformed into panic. We felt the acceleration of the engine.
I only had about 5 or 6 or 7 seconds to understand that there was something wrong, that we were going to crash. The last image that I had is the top of the airplane, the roof over my head opened and I died.
Fuerza Área Uruguaya 571, Santiago. Fuerza Área Uruguaya 571, Santiago. Fuerza Área Uruguaya 571, ¿me escucha?
The plane begins sliding down at a tremendous speed, and I was waiting for it to slam against the mountain, but it stopped. And when it stopped, I thought, I'm alive.
I stood in the impact site and realized that there's a saddle there, and that the pilots must have seen that saddle and gone for it to try to overcome the mountains. To the left, a little to the left or a little to the right, they would have hit cliffs and the plane would have disintegrated.
It was an extraordinary piece of luck, I would say, that the plane didn't disintegrate altogether when it hit the mountain, but really it clipped off the back of it, and then the front tobogganed down the mountain and didn't hit any. I mean, that was astonishing.
The fuselage ended up landing on this very steep gully. It was all covered in snow, luckily for them, which allowed the fuselage to slide down, make a couple of turns that are just a natural fall line, and lead them all the way to the bottom of the glacier. It was an extremely lucky situation.
I just think one must be careful when one uses the word miraculous. I mean, you've got to think of the people who didn't make it and who died and indeed who were eaten. I mean, you know, it obviously wasn't miraculous to the parents of those boys.
This is one of the seat armrests, and I found it high on the mountain. This belonged obviously to one of the seats that flew out the back of the fuselage. It was obviously very chilling to think if somebody was riding on that seat. This is testament to a very tragic moment.
None of us were familiar with snow. We were like little boys. In Uruguay, the maximum altitude is 500 meters, so we knew nothing. It was a disaster. Dead people, injured people, people with broken legs.
Immediately after the plane crashed, we went about attending to the wounded. I went over to Nando's mother. I touched her, and she was dead.
She was like wrapped around a seat in a position that was sure that she was not alive.
Nando's condition for us, it was a dead body.
He had flown from the back seat to the front seat, and his face was very swollen, and I could barely know whom he was.
And we moved Nando's body near the outside of the fuselage to make space for the ones who survived the accident.
The co-pilot was in a lot of pain, and he asked us to bring him the revolver in order to kill himself. because he was suffering so much.
Someone said that he was alive, and I realized that he was the key man that could tell us where we were, what was our location. He was completely trapped, so it was impossible to get him out.
Before the pilot dies, they hear him saying, "We passed Curicó, we passed Curicó." The pilot was in shock. He probably realized that he had made a mistake, but he's telling himself, but how can this be?
I remember very vividly that he said, "We passed Curicó," and there was a map there, and we began looking at the map, and Curicó was on the Chilean side very clearly.
You know, the survivors are thinking, this is the only reliable information we have from somebody who's supposed to know about this. So if we pass Curicó, that means we are on the western edge of the Andes. You find yourself in a glaciated valley at 12,000 feet in the middle of the Andes. It still today is a very remote place. It's like stepping into a giant freezer. This valley surrounded by peaks on three sides and kind of open to the east. The mountains around you are peaks that are 14, 15, 16,000 feet high. To the east you have El Sosneado, a volcano that's 18,000 feet. Very sheer, steep walls.
This party immediately had to protect themselves from the elements, or all of them may not have survived the first night or two. And they're put instantly into a very high altitude environment where now they have to start very quickly adjusting to the elevation.
The first night was horrible because the sun set at 4 in the afternoon, and we had to wait about 15 hours for the sun to come up again.
They quickly had to decide how they're going to survive the first night. Sharing warmth amongst themselves was probably the most important thing that they could have done. You're in this expectation that you're going to be rescued, and hopes are high, and you're going to do everything it can to survive those first few days until the helicopters come over the mountain and pick you up, and then they don't. And then friends around you die.
We move all the dead body to the outside of the fuselage, so we have more space.
After the plane crashed, and we didn't have any food, we shared a few little cups of liquor, some little chocolates, and that was all we had.
This load right here is huge for our business.
Nando.
If a person had an accident like the one Nando had, the treatment we would do nowadays in the 21st century is actually exactly what nature did to Nando with total serendipity in 1972. It was recently proven that low temperature, that is hypothermia, is one of the only effective neuroprotectants, that is something to protect an injured brain. The fact that Nando was considered dead and was put with the seriously ill and dead bodies close to the entrance and coldest part of the fuselage probably exerted a significantly protective effect of his injured brain. Based on a great paradox, the accident itself is what probably kept Nando alive.
The first things that I started seeing were the eyes and the faces of my friends who were very close to me, looking into me and speaking, "Nando, we crashed. Can you hear me? Can you listen? Can you hear? We crashed."
I remember Nando saying the first words, asking about his mother and his sister.
They said, "Your mother is dead, and Susie's wounded. She's hurt." my mind discarded in that moment my mother. I mean, she's dead. I can't do anything for her. So I focused on my sister and I crawled to where she was.
He was very devoted to her and was trying to do his best, but there was very little to do.
The first time I got out of there, I was shocked at the sheer majesty and size of the place where we were. Everything was white, 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 white. And it was cold and it was huge and silent. At an altitude of 11, 12, 14,000 feet, there is absolutely nothing. There's ice, snow, and black rocks. That's all. There's nothing that can provide any sort of food or nutrition. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Obviously, we waited for a rescue from the first, second, third, fourth day, but it didn't come.
We arrived in Chile, and they divided the search area between the Chilean Air Force, the Argentine Air Force, and us. And we performed a series of flights over the Andes, from north to south, something we had never done before. And we saw absolutely nothing.
Fue muy triste.
It was very sad.
La etapa que vivimos cuando
The stage we lived through when we didn't know anything. I was one of those who firmly believed that none had survived the Andes.
todo en la cordillera.
My heart told me that they were dead.
The last hours that I spent with my sister, with Susie, the only thing I could do was to hold her. We didn't have any medicines, we didn't have anything. She was very badly hurt, injured internally. I stayed with her the whole night. And I think that she was aware that I was there. She couldn't speak. She only looked at me with her beautiful eyes, and she died in my arms that night. At least I'm happy that she passed away with me, you know, not alone. The real hope died on the 10th day when we listened on the small transistor radio that we had that the rescue had been abandoned. And before the 10th day, we had this glimpse of hope, and after that, hope was non-existent. Hope only prolonged the suffering. The hope absolutely went away.
I said, Nando, there isn't anything left in the storage compartments where we kept the chocolates and a can of sardines that we had. And Nando looked me in the eye and said, Carlitos, I want to eat the pilot.
The struggle to survive was so strong, and the fear and the waiting for the helicopters and fighting the cold and the thirst and the stress and helping other guys. You know, days went by and I never felt pain in my stomach or anything like that. I was hungry, but I don't remember having any pain.
When people are in a starvation mode, what happens is we start taking all our food supplies from our liver. The next thing to go is typically muscle, and then our adipose tissue, our fatty tissue, and then we start digesting our internal organs. That's really what happens as people starve. They had to have a food source. You can survive only a few days without water. They had kind of solved that problem. But you can only survive in that kind of environment, from days to weeks without some kind of food.
When rescue is abandoned, you know that you have to eat. The chocolates are gone. And if you want to survive, and the survival instinct is probably the strongest instinct on any human being, it brings you to a different state of mind. The decision of eating the dead bodies of our friends started to creep into our minds at the same time, because we all had the same fear, the same lack of hope, the same confirmation that we were dead, that we were condemned, no rescue, we were abandoned to our own luck. On the same day, 3 or 4 or 5 guys started to speak about the same thing. I spoke it with Carlitos. I don't remember if I was the first one or not, but 5, 6 hours later, everybody was speaking about the same subject.
I said, Adolfo, Nando is crazy. He wants to eat the pilot. And Adolfo told me, he's not that crazy. My cousins and I have already been thinking about that.
It was very difficult to accept this idea. It was in the mind of many of us. We want to live, and the only way was to eat the bodies of our friends.
One of the things that was used to persuade some of those reluctant to eat the flesh of the dead bodies was the comparison with the Eucharist, the Catholic Eucharist, whereby Christ's body is turned into bread and you eat the bread, and it was a sort of analogy that helped some of the doubters, if you like, to eat human flesh.
The survivors had only a screwdriver and an axe that was on the plane, so they had to make more tools. And some of the tools that they made were knives made out of the plastic of the windows. And in February 2005, we had the luck to find one of these. This is one of the knives that they made. Well, the reason why they needed knives was to cut the meat. So obviously this was used for that. It was sharpened or cut with the axe.
It's terrible to invade someone else and to take advantage of someone that is dead. And the only reason I did it is because I thought that if I had died, I would be very proud to be part of the project of life.
It's hard to put yourselves in that situation, but being there, you would have been one of us. There is only one option. The decision comes quite easy.
Think about it. Every individual in that group had to look down, see little pieces of protein, little pieces of fat, and when they bring it up to their mouth, what's their mind telling them? For some, it's going to be, oh my God, this is my friend. This was someone in seat 3B. And in others, when they consumed it, and all of a sudden the body responded in a favorable way where they felt some strength, maybe some flow of energy back in the body, this was a glimmer of hope where they can survive and be rescued.
From a religious point of view, for me, it wasn't a sin. I understood that a body that was there, before the worms ate it, could be utilized by us. For me, that didn't affect me then, and it doesn't affect me now.
For them, trying at different parts of the body, eating organs that are more rich in vitamins, was essential for the nutrition. It was something that their bodies were craving. When they would try something different, it would taste good because the body's telling them, yes, you need more vitamins, you need this. Any different flavor was something that was highly welcome. So that's how they ended up eating everything. They ate almost every part of the body.
People use the term cannibalism for their food source. I actually consider it more of survival food. They did what they had to do.
I've read and I've seen our story described as cannibalism, which I think is wrong. Cannibalism is when you kill to eat. I mean, ancient warriors killed the enemy tribes and then they eat their dead, and it had a lot of tribal and spiritual meanings also, you know. In our case, I think the terminology that we should use is anthropophagy, you know, and it's just terminology. We made a pact, and we did what people do now. People give blood to friends, to family members. They make organ transplants, you know, and we made a pact. We said, okay, hand in hand, if I die, please use my body so at least one of us can get out of here. As a human being, you will see and do things so horrible you cannot even start to imagine. But things get worse.
We all know the Hells Angels is ready to commit violence if they have to.
Where the fuselage was a place that gets regularly hit by avalanches. It was just a matter of time before an avalanche would come down. Nobody in the plane had any experience with glaciers, with avalanches, with snow. That's one of the tragedies of the situation.
Avalanches have been known to move reinforced concrete buildings off their foundations. They've taken trains off the train tracks. They have taken steel bridges and blown them apart. So there is an enormous amount of impact pressure behind avalanches.
You're at the worst thing that can happen in your life. I mean, we were stranded in the Andes, surviving in the worst way a human being can survive.
For 3 consecutive days, it snowed and snowed and snowed. We were totally enclosed in the plane, surrounded by snow.
Surviving in that way, 2.5 weeks after the plane crashed, at night, in complete darkness, we heard a distant sound.
I've heard some people describe an avalanche when it started as a large boom, like a sonic boom from an airplane, as the avalanche failed on its weak layer. Sometimes they make hissing noises, and sometimes they're absolutely quiet, and you don't even know that they are coming down the mountain until they actually strike you.
Very quickly, we felt something like the sound of a pack of horses charging at us, coming from above.
It was something so lightningly fast. I heard the sound and I looked to my right, and at that moment the avalanche hit the airplane.
The avalanche came down off the mountain. It went right in the open end of the fuselage, blowing out the wall that they had built to help protect them, and buried all the people that were inside.
2 seconds later, I was completely buried by the avalanche.
Quickly, tons of snow got inside the fuselage and buried us completely.
I was trapped completely by the snow in the avalanche, and it's the most deadly silence you may imagine. I couldn't move.
You are stuck in this contorted position. You could be bent backwards with your heels against your head. You could be in a position where the pain is just unendurable, and yet you can't breathe anymore either. It can be a horrible, horrible way to die.
I felt I was dying, and then a smile came to my face because I realized that everything was over.
Roy Harley managed to get out, and then I got out. The first thing that we wanted to do was dig our friends out. Diego Storm, Nico Leach. But when I got to them, they were both dead.
It must have been an incredible panic situation. Now what do I do? What do I do? They're all in this confined space, but as soon as you move snow, you're piling it on top of other people because everybody's packed in so tight.
We continued looking for people, uncovering what we could.
I opened up my eyes, and I realized that I was alive, and they dug me out.
Roy Harley took all the snow from my face.
And I remember looking for the only woman who was alive at the time, which was Liliana Method. Looking for her, I found the head of Nando Parrado, and he managed to survive.
This avalanche killed 8 of us, you know? 8 of our guys were killed by that avalanche.
It's just another brutal blow, as if things couldn't get any worse. It seems, you know, the avalanche comes, kills 8 of them at that point. And it's hard to imagine, I think, you're trapped in this little space. The avalanche has completely covered the plane. There's no light, and now they have in that a little space and a little bit of oxygen to survive on. And they're on top of their dead friends, the ones that were just alive instants before. And to have to survive 3 days in something like that is, I think, is just one of the most horrible circumstances you can even imagine.
Our first concern was to be buried like a submarine without power in the bottom of the ocean. You know, you have water on top, how do you get out of there? And also if we had air. So we said, okay, don't move too much, breathe slowly, because we don't know if we have air. A lot of the guys said, okay, what does it matter if there's air or no air? We are buried, we are dead. If we get out of this burial of this fuselage, we will be on the same situation that we were before. Stranded, lost in the middle of the Andes, nobody's looking for us, we don't have any food, we don't have water, we're cold, we'll die anyway, so we're already buried, let's stay here. I think that the human spirit is stronger than reality sometimes, and we asked ourselves, what are we doing? You know, at least we are breathing, and if we are breathing, we are alive. Let's fight until we stop breathing. I found one of the poles that you tie straps to hold the luggage, and there was one of these poles in the floor, and I used it to make a hole in the top of the fuselage so that air would come in. I always think that if the avalanche hadn't happened, we wouldn't have survived. And people say, why? And I look back and I say, well, first the avalanche covered the airplane and all the blizzards and all the storms went over. So we were not hit directly by the storms. And secondly, we could wait there 1.5 more months because we had 8 more bodies. And it's very hard to think about that, but it's a reality. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I just followed my heart, my intuition. I wanted to go back to my father, and I didn't take into account all the risks that those things involved. Had we known what we were going to face, we would never have started.
You do all this research on the perfect car.
As the snow melted around it, it left the fuselage on a bit of a sort of a pedestal. So it was very unstable. And in fact, they were afraid that it was going to roll off into a crevasse.
Over the weeks, you know, they came into a routine of drying out the airplane and drying out their sleeping pads and gathering water and gathering food. And it comes down, again, to a routine of basics. They were in a survival situation.
The most secure place on that remote landscape was the fuselage. I mean, it was like a hut, it was like an igloo, and comfort was inside that place. You only got out of there because you had to trek, you had to test things, you had to explore.
You know, the Andes are an amazing mountain range. They stretch the whole length of South America. They're rugged, they're tall, the air is thin in the Andes, just like in any other high mountains of the world. So it is a very challenging and difficult range of mountains to try to climb.
The first guys who left the airplane for the first time, they just went away like 250 yards from the fuselage, and they found it so difficult to walk on deep snow, crevasses, that they had to return.
It was very hard to go out from the plane. It was very hard. Because the plane, in some sense, would protect you. I went out on 3 expeditions, went out and came back, always trying to look for the tail of the plane. And in the last expedition, I remember that I surrendered.
I returned with my eyes mostly blinded. burned by the snow because I didn't have any shades, and it loosened up my teeth, and my feet were practically gangrened.
It was very tough because you felt like an insect against the hugest forces of nature.
It is the story of being easier to die than it is to live. The most attractive option was to die.
Any survival story that you read about, whether it's on a desert island or in the middle of the ocean or in the mountains, people simply out of desperation improvise, and they build and make the things that they need to survive.
Once that we had created a couple of snowshoes, I was selected as the expedition leader because probably of my will to get out of there and look for my father and go back to him. And I said, okay, we have to test the equipment. We have to go further down the valley to see how we react ourselves as a team.
Nando became a kind of, you know, what in a boarding school would be called the head boy. I mean, he was the sort of, the younger boys looked up to him.
Roberto, Antonio, and myself, we left one morning to try to get away as far as we could from the airplane and come back in the day. It was a test, it was a research and development, you could call it. And we started to walk down the valley, down the valley, down the valley, and suddenly, as soon as we went over a small hill, we saw the tail. The tail had flown, had been torn from the fuselage, and it had cartwheeled down the mountain, and it was in the valley. There were a few suitcases there, and instantly we searched for food. We only found a small box of chocolates and the camera. We also found something that was quite interesting, which were the batteries. 24-volt batteries that were installed there at the tail. And we said, okay, we have batteries, we have radios in the cockpit, maybe we can make these radios work. So we decided to spend the night there, and the next day we went all the way up to the fuselage again, and we said, okay, we have to take the radios from the cockpit. Roy helped us. As he had assembled a stereo unit in his home, we declared him the radio expert. But you know that connecting radio equipment to batteries is not easy. We didn't have the knowledge. And from the back part of the radios, bundles of cables came out that we had to cut. How do we connect those cables to the batteries? Impossible, you know, they never worked. And another piece of hope was completely destroyed then. And we were very depressed because we had put a lot of hope on the radios working. When we found the camera on the tail, I remember saying, okay, it has a role. Let's take pictures because maybe this camera will be found, maybe 50, 60, 100 years from now, and they will reveal the role and they will see that people lived here because on our minds, we were going to die. So we took photographs.
Una noche me tiró con un One night, Arturo threw something at me, and he said he was in a lot of pain. So I lowered him, and he told me that he was dying. So for about an hour, I started doing CPR. When I stopped, he was acting as if he was going to die. And so I continued until finally I told him I couldn't do it anymore. And he got really calm, and he let go of my hands like this, and he died with the look of happiness on his face.
In the case of Numa Turcati, his physical condition told him that he was going to die, that there was no way out, and he did not survive.
We loved him a lot, and he never complained. He died weighing 55 pounds.
Waiting is horrible at that point when you're condemned to die. I kept speaking with Roberto a lot. Roberto, we have to get out of here as soon as we can. We couldn't try to escape to the south because we didn't know where we were going. To the north, the northern part of South America. For us, to the east lay the whole Andes. But to the west was Chile. And we had to aim to that country. We didn't know if we were in Argentina. In Chile, we only knew that to the west was Chile because of the sun. We would climb one mountain, and from the top we would see green valleys, lights of a city in the horizon.
To the west, we would be saved.
Their information indicated that the wise decision was west. They thought over that ridge has got to be the green valleys of Chile. To the east, not only did they think that the whole Andes was there, but there's nothing really encouraging for them other than the fact that it's downhill. The survivors didn't realize if they would have gone east into that valley, there's a hotel 18 miles away from them.
On the next Power and Ice.
Billy's got issues. I think it's time.
The hotel is 18 miles away. It is a hell of a hike out to get to that point. And it's on the other side of the Atuel River. And it's quite a big river, too. You can't really cross it, so most likely they wouldn't have been able to get to the other side where the hotel was. So it's easy to second guess once you know everything else, but they didn't.
Nando was very desperate to get out of there because he wanted to go back to his father and tell him that not everything was lost.
Nando was raring to go. He had this extraordinary determination to leave and get back to his father.
I think he realized that either he got himself out of there or most likely they were all going to die.
He at the same time understood that he needed support, so he asked me to go with him. And I saw that in the plane there were lots of people pushing Nando and grabbing Nando's thought of getting out of there, but they wouldn't go with him. So I thought that this was a very coward attitude of supporting someone, but not completely. At that moment I realized that I was the guy that could help Nando. Nando said, because you see very well, you can handle the maps and you're a handyman, and I want you to go. And Tintin was fit, Nando was fit, I was fit.
The last expedition was made up of Parrado, Canessa, and Vizintin, and they had the sleeping bag.
I had the idea that with the insulation you could make a sleeping bag. But I not only had the idea, I made it myself. And it was, without a doubt, the proudest moment of my life. The contribution that I made for that final expedition, that sleeping bag that I made.
Carlitos, with a needle and copper wire, sewed those pieces together, and we made like a sleeping bag that was fundamental to cope with the cold in the escape. We had already decided that the three of us were going to leave the airplane as soon as we had a window in the weather. Finally, we left on December 12th, the three of us.
They left to walk off, and Nando returns, and he tells me, Carlitos, before leaving, I want to give a kiss to your rosary. In exchange for that, he gives me a little shoe, and he tells me, Carlitos, I promise you that I'm going to come back for this other shoe. That he was going to come back to reunite the pair. But then he adds, and this is the most important, but if this doesn't happen and you guys need to use my mother and my sister, then do it. And that was such a great act because he didn't have to give us that authorization, but he did.
To the west is Chile, and this was the idea which we left the fuselage.
The only certain thing was to the west was Chile.
On the first day, we were very optimistic and full of energy, And at the beginning of the day, everything is very easy because the snow is very hard. But as the day passes by, the snow begins to melt.
I had never climbed any mountains before, so I didn't know what I was doing. But it was so strenuous, you know, at that altitude, you breathe and you get less oxygen. And I remember seeing those films with climbers walking very slowly towards the summits of the mountains, and I said, why don't they walk faster, you know? And then I was in the same situation, and I just couldn't move fast, you know? You just take 5 breaths and move one leg, and then the other leg, and you climb and climb.
When they were confronted with this head wall, they had 2,000 feet of climbing to do at a 45-degree angle, which is quite steep. And the snow was an impediment to their climbing higher. And you can imagine, without any skill, without any training, you're like a child when you are confronted with a snow slope. You try to go straight up, you might be using your hands and your feet, you're slipping, you're sliding, and for every step that you go up, you slide back a half a step.
And we tried then to climb through the rocky parts instead of the snow, leaving the snow. And this came on loose, and there were huge rocks coming down. I was telling Nando, we are going to kill ourselves. No, Nando, calm down. This is not the way.
I was so wasted, you know, when we reached one of the false summits. I said, there's no more strength in me, you know? And Roberto said, come on, are you breathing? You know, you're still breathing, come on, you can do it. Okay, I said, I'll keep on going until I stop breathing. You know, that was my thought. Nothing more profound, nothing more critical. I'm alive, I'm breathing, I'll keep on going.
And we put the sleeping bag, and the wind calmed down, and the valley was incredible. It was just gorgeous. The moon came down, and we had some run that we had found on the tail of the plane, and taking this run, and I couldn't believe that I was enjoying the scenery after struggling and crying and weeping.
What we were facing after the first day climbing that first mountain was not what I expected to find. The first day I thought I was going to be in the summit and looking at the green valleys of Chile, but we were halfway climbing the mountain.
It was very disheartening for the first 3 days, because it took them 3 days to climb up. What they thought would only take 1 day took 3. And for 3 days, we saw them as little points up there on the mountain.
Roberto was looking in the distance and seeing a line, thinking that could be a road. And it was impossible for them to tell if it was or not.
The road is very interesting because Nando says that the road doesn't exist, but the road is there, and I bet everything that I saw that road.
We actually know now that what he was looking at was the road. Once I was there, I took a photograph, and I realized that we could actually see the road that we use now from the east to access this valley.
But this is very interesting because although this was the right answer, at that moment was so in a chance in 1,000 that there was a road.
They were in a very tough situation. They had already made a huge effort to get that high on the mountain. And Nando still had the hope that looking over the top of the mountain, he was gonna see green valleys and everything.
When I was drawn down, Nando would say, let's keep going.
I would climb the mountain and I would see salvation on the other side. And when we climbed that first mountain, what we saw to the other side really froze me. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't speak, I couldn't even think, because what we saw was horrible. Instead of green valleys, we saw mountains and snow-covered peaks 360 degrees around us, to the horizon all around us. And I knew there that I was really dead. I decided the way I was going to die. There was absolutely no way we could survive what we were looking at. And I told Roberto, look, Roberto, there's no way we can go back. The only way is forward. We'll die, but we'll die trying. And, you know, he looked at me and he said, okay, we have done so many things together. Let's do one more. Let's die together.
Attention neighbors, I just got a great night's sleep on my Beauty Rest mattress.
When the three of them, Tintin and Nando and Roberto, got to the top of the mountain and saw there weren't the green valleys of Chile that they'd always supposed would be the other side of the mountain, it was a terrible moment, and psychologically it was a terrible blow. And again, it shows Nando's extraordinary sort of psychological resilience, that instead of being daunted and depressed and giving up in despair, he just said, right, we're going to go on, we're going to keep going west.
It's been said that hard and tough and challenging situations create character. I think they actually reveal character. When you're put into a situation, a desperate situation, all the things that you are and learned come out.
Roberto and myself, we got along very, very well together. We were a fantastic team. And I told Roberto, look, the three of us move very slowly. And we said, Antonio, please go back, give us whatever you have of food. The two of us would go forward and tell the guys that we'll climb and trek to the west.
Tintin, he was delighted. He beetled back down the mountain as quickly as he possibly could, because at least they felt safe in that plane. I mean, they had survived and would go on surviving.
After 3 days, we saw that one of them came down, and we went to meet him, and it was Visintin. And when we got there, he told us instead of finding the green valleys of Chile, they saw a pathetic and disheartening panorama. But Nando and Roberto made the decision to take Visintin's food and his extra clothes, and they sent him to the fuselage with a message that the two of them would forge ahead, and they wouldn't stop until they were dead.
He saw two peaks that had no snow on them. And behind those peaks you can see no more peaks, and you see the moisture of the Pacific Ocean. When you stand there and you look at how far those peaks are, it's really brings it home what a desperate situation they were in.
My need to get out was completely unique to me because there would be a time when we didn't have more bodies except the bodies of my mother and my sister. And I wouldn't even like to think to get to that moment when we would have to use their corpses to survive. I had to get out of there. And we started down the mountains. And that's it. It was two guys deciding to go forward.
And I said, let's go for it, let's forget about it. And I knew this was a no return way, but every step is a step. And if we had gone back to the plane, there were no chances.
I wanted to see what they were up against, what they had gone through, just how challenging it was, especially for a mountaineer. I was fascinated by it. So in December 2005, we retraced the escape route. We chose the same days that the survivors had gone. We wanted to experience the same snow conditions, recreate as much as possible the challenge that they had without, of course, killing ourselves. And so we brought equipment, we came prepared. Our plan was to try to set up similar camps to what they had done as closely as possible, but once we were on the slope was so avalanche prone that the whole slope could go. You could fall to your death, and so I didn't like it, and I thought the only thing to do here is just push and go all the way to the top in one day, and once you hit the ridge, you're safe. Avalanches, you're safe. Nothing is going to fall on you. And so it was a brutal day. It was a really hard day. We pushed really hard, and we went all the way up, basically covering the distance that Nando and Roberto covered in 3 days. It was exhausting. When you're in the mountains, it's much harder to judge distances. in sizes, and the valleys they climb down on and are just immense. They really, there's a picture that we took where you see this little dot and just a black little speck there, and it's actually Mario, one of our expedition members. And once you see that little dot, you realize the size of the valley you're looking at. It's very, very huge mountains all around you. It's really a very humbling experience.
What I remember of the 10 days with Roberto, it's like blurred images of continuous and strenuous effort. It was so huge, you know, the mountains are so huge that it looks like you don't make any progress, you know? And you think, okay, I'll get there in 2 or 3 hours or 5 hours, but it's so huge that you never get there, you know? The only way you go forward is because you can't go back.
Nando and Roberto, as they journeyed out for those 10 long, arduous days, that was an amazing feat. And you truly have to think about what they suffered through. They can't explain that. I think I have an idea of what they went through, but it's still quite an amazing feat.
I think it was Roberto that said, 1 foot on the ground and another foot on the snow. This is the line between life and death. I'm gonna make it. I'm not gonna die there like everybody else. I'm gonna live.
That line where the ice finished, for me, was the line between life and death for myself.
Yeah, it was like crossing a very thin line, jumping from one side to another one. We were very happy.
Now that the temperatures are warmer, now that they're not in such a danger to freezing, now they don't have refrigeration for their food. And so the food starts going rotten. And that's a new problem.
Nando and Roberto left the 12th of December 1972, and we were near losing our hopes.
The next day we were very, very happy to see things changing from the normal atmosphere of snow, ice, rock, and then we begin hearing water that was pouring out, and hearing water was going back to normal life. And then we saw this river that was growing out of the ice, and I saw a green spot there.
I had a grasp of life. First, when we saw that there was some civilization near, you know, we saw a cow. So there must be a human being nearby.
I was in a 5-star hotel. I had water, I had grass to eat, and I realized with what simple things we need to be happy and how we demand lots more than what we need in life.
The precise moment that I really knew that I was going to survive, I was looking towards the west, and Roberto was looking towards the north. And Roberto said, "Look, Nando, a man on a horse." And I looked, and instantly I saw him.
Shadow of shame has never fallen our name.
We started to shout, both of us. Somebody's looking at us. It's a human being. We couldn't communicate, but he looked at us because obviously he couldn't believe that there were two guys so high up in the mountains.
It was very difficult to communicate across this river because of the noise of this raging river. You can't cross it. There's just no way, no question. If you get down, it'll take you. It'll take you down, you'll drown.
The night came and we lost sight of him. And we spent all that night with Roberto. I remember talking. I said, okay, look, we are near civilization, so maybe tomorrow we'll get help, you know. I feel so happy now. How do you feel? You know, all those things. And we have to get help to the other guys. And the next morning at around 5:36, we saw a small fire on the shore, at the edge of the river, on the other side of the river. I was stronger than Roberto, so I went down. The sound of the water was so high that we couldn't understand each other. And this guy, with great intelligence and common sense, he got a small stone, put a piece of paper around it, tied it with a string, a pencil, and threw it across the river. And that's when I wrote that message, you know. I come from a plane that fell into the mountains. I'm Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a friend up there who is injured. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we do not know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come and fetch us? Please, we can't even walk. Where are we? For me, the most important part is the last sentence. Where are we? We didn't have a clue where we were. We knew we were in the Andes in South America. But that was our reference point. Where are we? I threw it back to him. He reads it. He looks at me, reads it again. I said, okay, wait there, wait. And he got on his horse, but before he threw me a little piece of bread and cheese, which I brought to Roberto. It took him 10 hours to go by horseback to the nearest civilization. When he got there, he got 5 or 6 military men on horseback from a military outpost, and he climbed back. And when they come back, we were so happy, you know. You were leaving behind horror, you were leaving behind death, and you embraced life again. And suddenly reality started to hit on us, you know, when we saw that journalists and newsmen from nowhere started to appear in the middle of the mountains.
¿Cómo pudieron sobrevivir ustedes? ¿De qué se alimentaban?
Bueno, sobre ese tema,
no,
sí,
no contestar.
¿Cuántos familiares tienes tú? ¿Tienes más hermanos?
Tenía a mi madre y a mi hermana que lamentablemente fallecieron en el avión y me queda otra hermana.
Nando lost his family. And I think this was very devastating for him.
They gave us some food, they gave us warm soup, I remember, and things like that. And then they displayed a map and said, where are the other guys? And I drew a circle in the map and they said, that's Argentina. That's El Sosneado. You couldn't have crossed the Andes on foot. And I said, look, I don't know if that's Argentina, but I know that they are there.
The distance they covered from where the fuselage was to Los Maitenes was about 37 miles. We measured it with GPS. The problem with that number is that these are really long miles.
What Nando and Roberto did still kind of blows me away. With literally no training, no skills, no knowledge of what they were doing, and no equipment, somehow they survived.
Having retraced the expedition, I think is just a really inspiring example of the human spirit, of what humans can do in extreme conditions when there's that strong will.
We heard the Uruguayan ambassador on the radio, that it was official, that Canessa and Parrado had appeared. Imagine that moment. What it was like to hear the names Parrado and Canesa. Because to hear these names was the end of our story, the end of our pain, the end of our fight. It was the beginning of our freedom. That was what we had fought for. Imagine what that was like. We were like crazy men around the radio. It still gives me goosebumps just thinking about it today. Hundreds of times and 37 years after it happened. Still, it makes me emotional.
And that's when they called for helicopters. And when the helicopters arrived, the same happened. Where are the guys? And I draw the same circle, and the pilot looked at me and said, look, I will never find them. You have to come with us. So they took me, put me on the helicopter, strapped me with seatbelts, headphones, a microphone, and we took off. The pilot kept telling to me, I don't have enough power, I'm too high for this type of helicopter. Are you sure? Are you sure you're not lost? No, I'm not lost, I know where I am. I remember the helicopter shaking and the plexiglass from the front vibrating. Looked like it was coming off the rivets. The engine of the helicopter at full power. And finally we crossed over the mountains, and then the pilot threw the helicopter down. I said, look, it's there, it's there. And the fuselage was white on white, so until we were about 300 yards away, he couldn't see it. And suddenly he said, I see it, I see it.
At last they were coming for us. It was something impossible to describe. An emotion so deep and so strong. It's very difficult to transmit with words.
Two of my friends jumped into the helicopter, and I grabbed Daniel at the third one with my hands, and the pilot took off. You know, he said, how many do we have? And I said, three. I said, close the doors, close the doors. So I went there, I closed the door, I closed the other door. I said, give me a break, please. You know, and these friends of mine embraced me, and they were crying and shouting, so happy. You know, I remember those smiles so big. And that was a wonderful moment, you know.
My father called me, and he was crying, and he said, Nando is alive, Nando is alive.
I was sitting in my bed, and hugging me, there was my father crying, and he was saying, you were right, he's alive. So that was the way I knew that Roberto Nando had appeared.
They were asking in Uruguay to give forth a list of the survivors. If it's for Uruguay, then I can give it to the country. And then I went about uncovering the names of the boys, and I started Fernando Parrado, Antonio Vicentin, until I came to the name of my son. And it's evident that I had to hold the phone down because of all the force of that name and the surprise and the marvelous feeling of knowing that my son was alive.
I got to the door of this old hospital, and I was shouting that I wanted to go in. Nobody could stop me. And he was very skinny, but so beautiful. And he held my father in his arms, and he pulled him out of the floor. He was strong.
People asked me, at that moment, did you feel guilt because you were alive? No, we said, we celebrated life. You know, we didn't have any guilt. What kind of guilt?
This load right here is huge.
45 people aboard, most of the members of a rugby team from Uruguay, crashed on a flight from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile. There was a search, but it was abandoned several weeks ago. Those mountains are a graveyard for airplanes. They're 18,000 feet high, they're icy cold, and continuing snow makes visibility there just about zero. And all those aboard were given up for dead. And then today, the incredible happened. 2 starving, exhausted survivors who had hiked for 10 days found their way to civilization.
I think that the biggest psychiatrist in the world would never find an answer to the human behavior over there.
Would I have done the same thing? I think, when it came out in America, everyone in New York was saying, how would I have behaved if I'd been in that situation?
In Spain, for instance, the first press releases had titles such as "The Cannibals Have Returned."
We had survived on the flesh of our friends, and we didn't want to hurt any feelings from the families, which were our families too.
These survivors in the most appalling conditions didn't turn into savages. They sustained one another. They kept their faith in God and that God would bring some of them out of it. I think it helped them enormously that when they were in Chile, still in Chile, and in hospital being cared for, a priest came by and said, "You did the right thing." And that the Catholic Church immediately said they did the right thing. The survivors had decided at this point that they wanted a book to be written, and they formed a committee to choose the publisher and the author. They were very afraid of what kind of book would be written. Inevitably, the truth showed that some of the survivors had performed in a heroic manner and others in a less heroic manner. But I felt that there was no point in writing a book unless you were going to tell the truth. The picture of Nando builds up in the book as someone exceptional and, in the end, the person who saved them all, comes from the other characters. It doesn't come from Nando himself.
It's very strange because we came out of the mountain with the same dreams. I had my house, my family, everything. And when he went to his house, his pictures were at the fireplace with the dead members of his family.
My father, being very pragmatic, said he's not coming back. So he gave away my clothes to people and he sold my motorcycle and he went into a very difficult mental state.
He loved my mother and my sister very, very much. He cried for them till the end of his life.
Nando tried to follow the normal dreams of a young guy, and he was completely lost. He didn't know what to do, where to go, and so I don't know if he was tougher when he was out of the mountain or when he was up there in the mountains.
The Andes made him stronger because he lost his mother and his sister. And later, afterwards, he continued with such an amazing force of will that really isn't able to be expressed or understood.
When I came back from the Andes, I said, look, what was the most important thing in your life before that? Before the plane crash, my father was the president of the Uruguayan Racing Drivers Association. So he took me to the races since I was very young. So I loved the sound, the cars, the racing, and I wanted to race. So I started racing because I thought it was important for me. It has nothing to do with the danger, with fear. No, it has to do with what I felt I should do in life.
I know I'm going to face maybe some dangers today, but I don't look back and say, well, I had so much fear, I don't want to have fear anymore. The main reason in my will of going out of there was seeing my family and my father again. So I thought that naming the highest mountain we climbed after his name, I know it was kind of a gift to him.
Even though he's gone through this tragic event, and lost his mother and his sister, you know, he decided that rather than grieve and completely shut down, why not revel in life? Why not revel in the fact that I survived this? And if anything, I think he kicked it up a notch and said, I'm going to take advantage of this life I have and do the things I love rather than not do anything at all.
And through cars, I found a beautiful girl. I married her. We have been married for more than 30 years. So I blessed the moment I decided I had to race cars.
2 años fuimos todos juntos.
2 years ago, we all went to the crash site together. It was an incredible experience. And I think that in some sense, it was a way for him to show his daughters where they were born. Because had Nando not walked out, not done what he did, they never would have been born. So it was a way of showing them the beginning of their lives.
If I balance, I have had a fantastic life. I had a fantastic family, and I'm doing what I love, which is appreciating the astonishing fact of being alive every day, every single breath. We went back to Chile with Roberto and Gustavo and our families, and we were driving through these dirt roads, climbing the mountains, and suddenly we see a man on a horse coming down the mountain, no? On the side of this small road. And we drive past him, and it was Sergio. We recognized him. So we stopped the cars, and Roberto and I, we ran towards him. I said, hey, sir, please stop, stop. And we said, we are lost. Can you help us? Can you tell us where we should go to? And he looked at us, and he started crying. I have that photograph of Sergio and the two of us, 35 years later. We remember him, and whenever we can, we go and visit him, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Nando Parrado.
Sometimes it's very difficult to speak about oneself, you know? But it's nice to feel that sometimes you can give something back. I don't know if I have a message I can share what I feel and what I learned and what my life has brought me to. It's hard sometimes, you know. Life is simpler than it looks. For me, love is the most important thing in the world. The love for our families kept us alive. You know, I would also like to honor all the people that were on that plane. Because instead of Nando here, Marcelo could be here, Guido, you know, Arturo, Alexis, Gaston. Why am I here and not them? That's one of the questions that will never have an answer. And sincerely, I wish that you were here, that we would have never boarded that airplane, you know? I send you the biggest and warmest embrace I could give, wherever you are, and you're always in my heart.